hear the term do tank a lot when I'm talking, because I love the fact that we get in and do the stuff around reducing embodied carbon in the built environment. There's a lot of policy work. We know the policy context has maybe got a little stronger in the last little while, with the NDCs being announced 62 to 70%. There's no way Australia will get to that reduction unless we reduce embodied carbon in our buildings. And as Jeff will set out shortly, and you will recognise by dialing in, that design plays a key role in that. So thank you for joining this initial session for a working group on designing out embodied carbon. I'm joining you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and like every MECLA event, we recognise that we're on Indigenous land wherever you are around the country. Another thing that applies to all MECLA events is our governance framework. It's an important thing to mention because it's what keeps us operating in a pre-competition space, and that's really important because, you know, the construction sector is very competitive, and at the right time, that's absolutely appropriate. But to solve systems problems, system scale challenges needs collaboration. So we have to do that in a pre-competition space. Please keep that in mind. And we have to avoid conflicts of interest. We all wear different hats at different times. That comes up. We have a register of interests. As things progress, we'll point you in that direction, but it's important we avoid anti-competitive behaviour and keep that front of mind. I'd also point out that MECLA is in its fourth phase. I don't want it to sound like a giant science-fi trilogy, or it'd be beyond a trilogy if it's the fourth phase, but I think you know what I mean. It's about, you know, our funding model and where we are at as we've been from kind of startup to scale up, how we fund MECLA from now on. We are moving to a funded model by members. So yeah, in the new calendar year, it'll be funded members only in working groups. Just need to raise that. Now, the bulk of this session will be led by Jeff. Jeff has until recently been leading our aluminium working group, and they really did some fantastic work leading the development of knowledge and understanding of where aluminium and low carbon aluminium can get to. There may be further work for aluminium to do, but for now, turning interest and effort to designing out embodied carbon. Jeff, thank you for putting your hand up and raising the need for this. You've clearly tapped into something, judging by the number of people who've dialed in and who registered an interest in this. This will be a working session. Please, if I can hand over to you to take us through that, but encouraging people, this isn't a lecture. We've got the Secretariat on board. We're here with our cameras on, please, just so that we can, you know, this is humans, not bots. Really keen for this to be interactive. Our colleague Alexi Barnstone from CKIC in the Secretariat will be taking some notes so that we've got reference to come back to. But for now, thanks everybody for your time. MECLA only works because of the people and because of the leadership. Jeff, over to you. Thanks very much, mate.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hudson. I will just share my screen. Get that up and going. Bring everybody back. Right. So yes, absolutely. Certainly don't want this to be a lecture, but it's great to see so many people dialing in. I am Jeff Morgan. I'm a principal at Hassell in architecture. And as Hudson mentioned, I've been chairing the aluminium working group for a number of years now. And I guess just having the privilege to sit on the MECLA's PCG, there's a lot of great conversation that goes on there. And one of the ideas that have been bubbling around for a little while was the idea to have a working group focused on the opportunity of designing out carbon. Let's see if I can go forward. Can I go forward? Clearly, I don't use PowerPoint. There was a really great sort of spotlight that was event that was held, I believe, last year. Really great work and research and kind of knowledge sharing around that. And I guess sort of off the back of that, the discussion at the PCG was, well, is there more work to be done or should be done or could be done? And Obviously, as an architect, it's something that I'm quite passionate about, and I know just from personal experience that, having designed some buildings and then, an engineer saying to me, well, if you would have done this or that, you would have saved easily 30% of embodied carbon. And I, kind of sighed and said, oh, well, yeah, I wish I would have known those things. So I guess the idea is around these groups is trying to understand what are the practical things that we can do. You may, for whatever reason, not choose to do them all or some of them on every particular project, but I think it's about developing a series of guides of really practical, simple steps, design decisions that you can make. But as long as you know that there are things that can help you as a designer design out carbon. So the proposal that you're literally seeing the proposal that I put forward to the BCG. So I'll just run through this document. It's not very long. But the idea is that, as Hutchin mentioned about being a do tank, we really like to come in and have a purpose. And that purpose is around not only sort of building and sharing knowledge, but more importantly around sort of, I guess, outputting that knowledge, whether that's through documents that are uploaded to the to the MECLA website, whether it's through further spotlight events where we really share and focus on that information. But if you haven't been involved in a working group to date, there's obviously not really an opportunity to come around and sit around for an hour or two every few weeks. We're really looking for people that are keen and interested in these areas, that have a bit of time. I understand that everybody is extremely time poor, as am I, but I really do think with a bit of collaboration and a bit of leadership, we can probably put together some really great sort of practical guides, as I like to call them. So the initial 4 areas I had thought about that I thought initially, could be really well served by having some focused attention on were what I call general, for lack of a better term. And maybe once we start to work through that together, we can come up with a better sort of name for that group. But that just applies generally to the principle about designing out carbon. Facades, structure, and interiors. And I'm sure there might be more of you on the call. I'm really happy to have some suggestions around that, about what other groups we could consider to do those sorts of things. And really what we're looking to do now is to gauge interest out of the group on the call today, is who's interested in not only being a part of the group, but if anyone's really keen to lead up one of the subgroups, that would be really fantastic. Hudson, I see you've got your hand up.
I do, yes, trying to be polite.
Oh, good.
But in terms of focus areas, I'm keen also, bearing in mind MECLA is build, construction and infrastructure. I'm keen, not wanting to dilute from the vision, but if there's a group within the people dialed in who might maybe just put their hand up and say, look, I work in infrastructure, not buildings, and it's an important thing for me and for us, then I'd encourage the group to consider that.
Absolutely. Yep. Or any other sort of adjacencies or any other areas. I guess the reason I sort of outlined the initial 4 is that's just, in my sort of experience as an architect, the 4 sort of areas that I generally have more sort of day-to-day interface and knowledge and understanding of. But certainly if there are more, very happy to entertain those. And I guess, so, we're trying to keep it pretty simple. Groups don't need to be overly large. Of course, if there's a lot of people that are interested, that's fantastic. But like I said, we really want people that are going to contribute and help sort of develop these sorts of documents or guides, or really shape what the direction of the group and the sort of outputs. But initially, I had thought that if we could, as a collective, produce what we called sort of 10 pagers. So if each group was able to produce something like a 10-page structure or a sort of guide, they could be read as a suite of documents. And, we could potentially, in a maybe first half of next year, organize another spotlight on designing out carbon, where each of the group chairs or people that we invite in could present the findings, present the work, and hopefully with the aim of really demonstrating that there's some really practical steps, like key things you can really think of or really, I guess, make a choice on through these guides, through using these guides. So the groups don't need to be big, but we do need people that are keen to do stuff, and we need obviously a leader for each group that's willing to sort of get the group organized and meeting regularly. I think it would be beneficial, just given my experience with MECLA and chairing a working group in aluminium. I'd be happy to sort of set up that sort of framework so that each subcommittee working group chair isn't sort of starting from scratch. I think there's a lot of good knowledge and experience and templates within MECLA, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel or spend too much time sort of thinking about how this is all going to be done. I think we could probably get to that fairly quickly. Yes, CJ, you've got a question or a comment?
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of thought on how do we make sure that this work that we're going to put in is a value add to the industry, because there's a lot of sources already out there that have a lot of really good content. Like I'm structural, and iStructD, amazing resources. They've done a ton of work in sustainability, and I've already put a lot of effort into creating a lot of resources out there. And so I think having a strategic approach to this to make sure that the work that we're doing is bringing stuff in and presenting it in a way that is valuable to industry is a key thing for this point.
Well, thank you for nominating for the structural group lead. But no, that is exactly, I couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. That is exactly the intention, just in my, I guess, hobby. I've collecting lots of those sorts of documents you're talking about. And I guess one of the ideas is like, this isn't a research piece. We don't need to go out and invent, another piece of research for something that's already been done by a group that's probably funded well better than we are. But it's actually to draw upon existing content, existing projects, existing experience, and reference that information, but also probably to distill that down, because sometimes there's some really great guides or research pieces that have been funded by all sorts of people, and they might be 200 pages long, but there might be like, what are the sort of 5 key takeaways that are there that as a designer you can use to sort of make those decisions early on. So absolutely leaning into existing research and documentation that's already there and citing it, obviously crediting all of those sorts of information. So yeah, I do see it as like as an information gathering, but then also distilling and trying to really pull out from a number of different sort of sources what some of those great guides are. The general ones probably not necessarily a challenge for me, but clearly like the thinking around this group is something I'm sure you're all familiar with, this diagram on the hierarchy of net zero design around the best thing we do from a design point of view is just to build nothing. So the idea was to kind of work through those sorts of filters in a little bit more detail and sort of set the tone or the overview for all of the other subgroups, I suppose. And I would imagine this group could have a really good mix of different disciplines and people within that group, not just necessarily structural engineers or facade engineers, as may be the case in the other subgroups. But if I quickly go forward to the next one, this is one of the studies, and as I'm sure there are many, but just to illustrate that point, yeah, we're not looking to reinvent the wheel here, but we're looking to say, what are the decisions we can make on column grids or reducing cantilevers or whatever the case may be? I'll give an example. I designed a building, hasn't been built yet, luckily, that the premise on the structural design was to minimize the number of columns in the floor plate. That ended up in a number of cantilevers that really had a lot of great outcomes from the workplace point of view or from the ground plane point of view. But had I moved the columns and introduced another row or put the columns on the facade over a very large tower, it would have made a really huge impact on reducing the embodied carbon. And had I really known or understood that at the time, and that was going back 6 years now, I'm sure I would have made very different decisions at that time. So I guess it's a way of really simplifying the sort of data and the numbers and the thinking that go into a lot of these great reports and making it very simple, like more columns, no cantilevers, sort of, just to give a few examples of those sorts of things. From a facades perspective, I'll just use the example again in the same vein. Lots of great information that's already out there. I recall a conversation with a facade engineer that said, oh, well, if you move your stack joint, and I'm going to make it up now because I'm going to get it wrong, but if you move your stack joint 600 millimeters up off the floor slab, you can reduce your structural extrusion thickness by about 20 to 30%. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, but I had already done the competition design. It was a bit too late, and it would have had a pretty big impact on the design and the aesthetic of that facade. But had I known that from the beginning, I could have worked with that piece of information and designed a facade differently. So again, it's those sorts of things. We may get into material selection a little bit, but the idea is that if we do start to think about materials, it's possibly, and I'm really keen to hear thoughts from the group, that it's materials relative to a facade system. So whether it's the structural, whether it's kind of steel or aluminium, but then also what are the sort of cladding materials that you can get, that you might choose to put as your sort of solid spandrel areas. Or if you're looking at the next group, for instance, interiors, what are the materials that sort of apply to floor finishes or wall finishes or joinery and those sorts of things. So again, another great reference, and I know BVN just recently launched another great DFIT guide that's received a lot of really great attention. So yeah, that's the intention. You really hit it on the head there, CJ. That's what we're looking to do. But I guess really short, sharp, practical steps you can consider from the outset. And I guess, yeah, that's really what we'd like to achieve. It's that simple. It's that short. So I'm actually really keen to hear who we have on the call. Oh, good old Tom. I knew Tom would put his hand up. I was hoping you would. Who's out there, who's interested, who would like to be involved, and who would like to possibly lead, or think of another group as Hudson was talking about. So Tom, I'll hand it over to you first.
Good old Tom. I'll take that, Jeff. Cheers. I guess
Yeah.
Simple question first being who the audience are, who are the proposed recipients of the guidance, and how is that kind of targeted or
Well, that's a very good
disseminated,
question.
I guess.
That's a very good question. I would broadly say designers. However, I would expect that as a facade and a structural engineer that you would know a lot of this already. And CJ, as a structural engineer, you would know a lot of this already. I guess the challenge that I've had as an architect is I learn about the opportunities that I can do on a facade and a structure usually after the fact. It's like, a lot of things sort of happen, or particularly in a competition environment. And I know that is sort of slightly unique, but I think it would be very beneficial to architects to have this sort of general knowledge in these areas. Certainly for interior designers, obviously, in that sort of scope, but I would like to think that, your average competent structural engineer would know a lot of these things already, so that might not be the audience. Do you have any other, before I go to Kati, I was going to say, any other thoughts on who you think the audience might be?
I mean, we tend, when we're doing these exercises at EOC, we tend to think about the client and the brief first. So a huge amount of the reduction comes from how that discussion goes and how that happens. Obviously, the architects and the design teams are second, and then the contractors and the specifiers third. And so we think about it in three chunks, basically. So I guess in this context, we're talking designers, but I just wondered whether anyone else thinks it could go a little bit earlier in the process and start to look at clients, developers, etc.
Well, certainly that general category, I would imagine that fits very easily there in my mind. Like as a client, if you're having those early conversations, do you actually need to build another building or tear this one down? Could you just refit it, or how much refit do you actually need? So yes, I think absolutely that would go to sort of clients. Thanks, Tom. Great to see lots of hands coming up. Kati, I might throw to you first. I'll just go in numerical order.
Yeah, I'm Kati Verheyen. I'm on the MECLA Secretariat, for those of you who don't know me. I think on that question of audience, it's a fantastic one. And I'm wondering whether, if you're looking at the general setup, whether looking at something like local councils and all those who are thinking about the drawing up ideas for what needs doing would really benefit from some of that information that you're having in that general setting, and especially things asking about what are the right questions to ask your designer before you hand over to keep those decarbonisation options in there, because often if that's not defined up front, or like if that question isn't even put to the designer, does it get included in the design decisions? So,
or in the brief development.
Or in the brief development,
that's right.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
And in that case, it would involve a lot of really, really simple language for not engineers, for not architects, to sort of formulate that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I do see this. See all the guides try to be quite simple in their language and approach, and not overly detailed or overly technical, if possible. Clearly, I haven't done the work, but in my mind, I guess that's kind of the way I was seeing it. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. Adriana, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So thank you. I'm not an architect or a builder, but I am a circular economy professional, and I've been attending many MECLA meetings, particularly in building services, all this year. So my question is, because I'm very focused on materials within my focus of interest in the circular economy, how much will be your focus on materials? That's question part A. Part B is, will you be looking at what percentage of those materials are manufactured in Australia and what are manufactured overseas? And then part C is, will you be delving into your supply chain to look at how you can reduce or how you can decarbonize your materials that arrive in your buildings? So that's my one question, 3 parts.
I might have to come back to you on the parts because I've got a very terrible memory, but the first thing I'd say is that yes, there is an intention, certainly, to address materials selection. My personal feeling is within each of the categories itself, so not to have a general sort of materials subgroup, if you like, but materials that are specific to interiors or specific to facades or specific to structure. We obviously do within MECLA have the materials working groups of aluminium, steel, concrete, timber, et cetera, and those. Hudson, you'll have to remind me if the other group, which was functioning, is still in function, but their sort of remit and purpose was looking at the kind of the key materials, the high emitting materials, but then also opportunities for more natural materials. Yeah, so Hudson, is the other group still going, or what's the status?
Yes,
there?
it is. Yep, no, it's still very, very much underway, and we're about to have a session with them and the New South Wales EPA to start tackling some of the regulatory barriers to the increase of recycled materials going into those component materials. My take on that question is that yes, the material subgroups do focus on the individual materials, and I would see the question as it relates to design as what are the material dimensions of design to reduce carbon, rather than drilling into particular materials. But
yeah, if I could maybe use the example of aluminium. So we did a lot of great work on the sort of what we call the challenge of low carbon aluminium in Australia, being our electrical supply and obviously the energy that's required to produce aluminium from that carbon intensive electrical supply. We talked about, well, even if we were producing carbon-free aluminium here, would that actually make a difference to our buildings if so many of our large-scale buildings, I'm not talking about sort of smaller scale things, but larger curtain walls are coming from overseas. So we looked into China. We did case studies on actually what the opportunity was in China, and as a result of that, we had one of our clients actually procure Australia's first low-carbon aluminium facade from China. And when we started that conversation, we had all the facade subcontractors and main contractors, tier 1, 2, and 3 kind of contractors on the call. They were saying 10 years if you're lucky before you can get something, and you'll be lucky to have any sort of comfort around the certification of it. And we ended up getting ASI certified aluminium over the entire, and low carbon over the entire facade. So I don't think necessarily we're going to go into that level of detail in this working group, but it might be materials will come into it, but I don't think in that depth, I believe, is my feeling.
Okay, well, anyway, just to let you know, I don't think it'll be 10 years. I think that it'll be a lot sooner, given the metal forecasts coming out and how recycled or secondary raw materials in metals are becoming really super vital to meet demand. So I think it'll be less than 10 years, but I'm just wondering how, your supply chain will be critical to your decarbonisation outcomes. So anyway, you've answered part of the question. I'll see how we go along with the rest of the how the working group evolves.
I agree with you. It won't be 10 years. Like I said, we've already, within less than 2 years, we've already had a client, source fully low carbon, I'll say 4 kilograms on the raw virgin material from China with ASI certification. So certainly not the 10 years. And yes, the secondaries metal market is continuing to expand here in Australia for sure. So fully agree. Kate.
Hi, sorry.
Okay.
I work in the state government space for school infrastructure, and I just wanted to second what Kathy mentioned about, I know she mentioned local government agencies, particularly potentially using the tool. And I do think that this is something that we could draw on and put forward as a reference, because we don't always get to choose the consultancies that are assisting us on our projects, and there are varying degrees of expertise in that space. So while some structural engineers are wonderful and will know exactly what they need to be achieving, it could potentially be a really good reference to put forward to those that need a little bit more direction. And I was also going to mention, if there are different stakeholders using the documentation, it might be good to have different areas within each of the subgroups to maybe sense check for digestibility of that information and how it could be interpreted by people with different backgrounds.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very good. So I'm just making a few notes. Thanks, Kate. Usha.
I think there's actually somebody well before me who's still got his hand up. So
sorry.
I don't know if you saw.
The numbers keep shifting on me.
Sorry, I can't see the name. Yeah, I can't see the name, but who
think
one
it's
is
Nick.
with a hand
Nick.
up?
Yeah, we'll
Feel
go
free.
Nick. Sorry, your numbers keep changing on me. Sorry, Nick.
No problem. Hi from New Zealand. My name's Nick. I work at McDonald, both in New Zealand and Australia. I was just going to add to the who your audience is, both direct and indirect, and we've certainly found here that by creating country-specific guidance and tips, it has legitimized some of those approaches in people's mind outside of just the design community. In fact, the people that commission the designers to do the things are starting to take on board some of the ideas. So yeah, I think you definitely want to consider that part of the likely people to influence through the guidance.
Okay, very good. Thank you. CJ, your number doesn't change, Usha. You'll forever be number 2 on my screen. Sorry, CJ.
Yeah, so to elaborate on Katty's point, I think it's not only what question to ask, but when to ask those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really critical thing to focus in on, because I've looked at a lot of resources online and there isn't a whole lot really getting into the details specifying what specific questions to ask at specific different design points throughout the design, right?
Yeah.
This is something I'm looking at in my own company right now, is looking at, okay, what are the factors that we can influence? For instance, dead load in a building, right? You set a factor initially at concept design, but then to make sure that you're coming back to that question as a quality check later on the design, once you have clarity on all of the partition loads and everything else in the building, to verify that your conservative element that you had in the beginning has been back checked and quality checked at the end, right? And so I think that there's a piece of work here aligning the different questions for the different trades, structures, facades, interiors, and aligning them to those specific points, so that way a client can know, okay, in these different specific areas, we know what to ask and when to even come back to those questions if needed later on in the design.
That's a really good point. And obviously it just makes me think about the audience, like I kind of said that, I'd assume that as an engineer that, you might know this all already, but, I think also to Kate's point, not everyone has the same experience, the same approach, same understanding. So I think there is, the audience wouldn't just be necessarily like I kind of initially thought as an architect for the structural one, but also other structural engineers. So yeah, really great insight there. Usha, finally.
Thanks. Usha Raniga, Professor Sustainable Built Environment at RMIT University and co-lead of Secular Built Environment for the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. I was thinking, what is the basis for dividing this across general structure, facades, and interiors? Is this because of the shelf life associated with this approach, or was there some other reason? Because I also think we need to think about it across the full life cycle of buildings and infrastructure. And we also need to think about, for instance, changes on the horizon, ISO standards for circularity that has an impact on carbon, financial reporting, sustainability reporting, all your different types of sustainability reporting that also needs to be taken into consideration. And I also wanted to make an offer that if this group and across MECLA want to present your findings or run a roundtable or run a special event, an industry event. I'm co-convening the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference in Melbourne in 2026, 10 to the 12th of June. I can put the details in the chat. More than happy for you to bring this to the conference as well. So a few things in there. Thanks.
No, that's great. I think what this call's really been helpful for me in particular is understanding the very narrow focus I had in my own particular experience as an architect and the questions that sort of come up quite regularly in my own experience. But clearly with the diversity of people and backgrounds here, and there's so many more sort of ways to look at the problem or questions to be asked or different audiences to address. So I can only think that, well, I guess maybe to answer your question, yeah, the formation of those things were that I guess as a designer, there are things that we design. We design facades in collaboration with other engineers. Often, and Tom, you can tell me if I'm wrong, an architect would come and say, I want to do this. Can you make it work? And you might be like, well, yeah, we can make anything work, but would you think about that? And an architect may go, oh, well, no, I don't really like the look of that, or I don't really want to do that. But so I guess it's around, yeah, it was kind of with that focus that we try to give people sort of a framework that they can start to, it's just more, the more you know about something, obviously, the more you sort of approach designing it or thinking about it differently. And it's, again, just like I said, from my own very narrow experience, there's lots of things that have come in my, even just over the last 5 years, that I was like, as I said, if I would have known that from the outset, I would have started designing completely differently. So I don't think it's rocket science or overly complicated, but I do think there's a richness that will come with the sort of diversity of input and experience. Malay, is that how you say your name?
Yes, correct. Thanks, Jeff. Malay Dave from Stinson Warming. This is more of a question, and there is a really interesting conversation happening in the chat as well. The design versus materials conversation. And the question is whether we consider what we, the architects consider good design. And a lot of the time it starts from preconceived notions of what the good aesthetics of a building needs to be. And the facade design and a lot of the award-winning buildings, sometimes sustainability award-winning buildings, have pretty inefficient or problematic facade systems with inefficient shading strategies or certain aesthetic gymnastics happening without consideration of embodied carbon. Now, that aspect of design is not necessarily considered in a quantitative realm, but largely in a qualitative realm. And the sense of delight and all the other aspects of architectural purpose still need to be met, of course. But this tension between what is considered as good design, or how the designers are primed to consider certain designs as good design, and how much price we pay in terms of carbon because of those designs, are those aspects of design considered part of the scope for designing out carbon in this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if I use the example of facades again, this is going back a number of years now, and it wasn't a project I was on, but to your point and to what I was kind of talking to Tom about just before, there was an idea about a facade and materiality and what the sort of shape of this facade was doing, and actually what it ended up doing was creating a whole lot more sort of supporting structure framed out of aluminium to support this very heavy terracotta panel that was sitting quite a far away off the slab edge. So, there was a lot of work that I understood had to go work backwards to kind of undo a lot of that thinking. And so that's, to me, precisely the sort of thing where designers or architects who kind of, come up with some pretty crazy or silly ideas sometimes, that, if they had a little bit more knowledge about what the knock-on impacts were from the outset, I think we'd have, better holistic outcomes. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. It is mostly, it does address, and it's good that it is going to be considered, because the real frustration that I feel is that we design buildings, create the problem, and our rating systems right now are set up such that you create a problem and then reduce the embodied carbon by 10, 20, 30, 40%. And there is inherent inefficiency within the approach to design. Materials come later on. What materials you specify is later on. If the design itself is inefficient to start with, we have a lot to do there.
Well, you've got my support and CJ's. I can see we got a round of applause from CJ. So, yeah, really would hope to think that you would bring a lot of that sort of perspective and experience to one of the groups. Is it Raisa?
Yeah, Raisa.
Raisa.
Sorry, it's Portuguese. It's a bit hard.
It's okay. I'm American. You got to forgive me.
So, sustainability engineer. I love that we have all this different diversity in here. Just want to put a bit of my perspective here as well. So, I guess what's tricky for me is many times when we get engaged, even early in, to do either a certification or just a sustainability framework, it's quite hard because we have to discuss with all these different engineering, facade engineers, structure, all of that. And I would say, yes, people are getting more educated, but I still think that there is a big piece of education that we need to put in place. The second thing I want to say is I like the way you've broken down the general structure, facades, interiors, but also
also want to try to understand or rationalize, because usually when I do LCAs or embodied carbon calculations, we have to consider like a reference building. How are we going to break this down into like these different pieces where like each discipline or each group is going to be taking into consideration something different? I don't know, it looks a little bit tricky for me. Usually it's easier to follow like a criteria that is already around. We've been using Green Star criteria. It's quite stringent nowadays, but it does work, and it also helps to like projects not to greenwash that much, because you do see around like sometimes people go and they create a building that was never the actual case, and they're like, our reference building was this, but we remove all of those things and we came up with this amazing design, which was never a reality. So this can also happen, and it's good to prevent that too.
Very good. Thank you for raising that. No, that's really interesting point. Do you have a, like, I guess having a very broad or an overview of a lot of things, is there any particular working group you might like to focus on, or would it be more the general, or not quite sure yet?
I
put you on the spot.
It would possibly be either the general, but I'm also very interested in deep fitting, which is like, I guess, a new concept for interiors. But yeah.
So just on that, it just made me think while you were speaking there. So for instance, on the interiors, clearly interior designers, there's a lot of great work. I mean, I think Australia's workplace, in particular workplace interior designers are probably the best in the world. So we've got a lot of great talent and experience here to draw on, but yeah, also clients, the clients that sort of every sort of 7 years on average want to refit their buildings. What are the strategies that they can start to write into their briefs before they actually select an interior designer? So there's another sort of audience for you. Kieran.
Hi, thanks. I'm Kieran Leong. I'm an architect at Design Inc. in Melbourne. And I think maybe just to perhaps echo, but probably maybe put another angle on what Malay was saying. So I think you've talked about who and when, and I think we're all here because we appreciate a why, but I feel like some clarity around the why might make a little bit of sense, because on one end of things, we can say the ambition of these is to influence societal change and convince people that convince all of the things that we know as common sense, right? So do less bad stuff to the world. But it's really, I don't know if these short documents are really going to do that. I think, so it could be that, or it could be just lowering the bar of entry to get some basic knowledge to say, because I think what's lacking, what I see as an architect and trying to bring things like both learn myself and bring the practice along to do things better, is that it's so easy to get overwhelmed with everything. And a real, of course, you always risk oversimplification, but a simplified guide, which is what I'm sort of hearing you say, I think could have huge value. So I think it's probably about pitching that, having that as an intent. And I think that the other thing that was mentioned before, just to say it again, but I think to the side, I think there's a general one for the design world or the cohort, and then I think a general one for people who are more client side setting the brief for projects. So to lower that bar to allow people to create the briefs, because when we get the projects, it's often too late to do that, or you have to luck out and get the right consultant who has the knowledge and the expertise, the willingness, all of that to do it. So maybe a sort of side topic to that one could be useful. I see them as perhaps separate to each other.
That's a very good point. And I think all those sort of conversations, I think the key thing for us, I'm just kind of mindful of time, because ideally what we'd like to do today is have a few people put their hands up, if you would, either participate or obviously potentially to chair a working group or a subgroup. That would be great. But I think all of those sort of conversations, obviously we go into a lot of great detail in each of the subgroups. And I think obviously it would be beneficial for us as a group of subgroups to come together, in some sort of quarterly fashion, so that we're all Obviously, I'd probably be sitting in on all of them just to sort of understand what's going on. But I think to get those sort of 4 groups together, share brief updates, are we sort of approaching the same way? What do we think? You know, I think would be really important. Carolyn, hello.
Hi there. Sorry, I've got my camera off. My Wi-Fi is really bad. Just wondering, I mean, I think the whole issue of design is so critical because so many decisions are made and materials are, you know, are critical to those decisions, but they're not as impactful as the design decisions, which is what you're talking about. The carbon reduction roadmap, which I think RMIT and Jared Reinmuth and others, based on the Danish one, brought out, kind of puts a very scary figure on how much carbon we should be using for each of our buildings. And I just, you know, if you actually put a budget on it to match the 1.5 budget that we've actually signed up for Paris. And one of the things that Gerard was saying is that, you know, we start with an acknowledgement of country, and Denmark, they start with an acknowledgement of how much carbon is in each of their buildings. And I reckon that might be a really good place to start because it just kind of brings it out a bit and helps people to actually go, holy shit, and how many tons per square metre? Because I think the levels of literacy on this are really low, hands up for me, you know. And until those sorts of basic levels are increased and we start to actually understand the implications of, you know, what a currently thought of as beautiful building is costing the planet, you know, we've got to start having different conversations that sort of enable those things to happen.
No, I really like that, Carolyn. And maybe that's a really nice, I don't know, just thinking, obviously, just responding initially, like really nice sort of scene setting as to the importance of this whole sort of topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, cheers. I'm trying to just get my head around what general is, and I think actually a few people have talked about this in terms of there being a context or a need for a kind of primer or an introduction, and I'm just thinking in the wider MECLA world that there's already there's a certain hierarchy. And I wonder if we're already getting a hierarchy here. And I feel like, you know, if we take general and actually put it above the other 3 as a kind of explainer, it's, you know, it's kind of targeted at clients or people who are kind of trying to find an introduction to this subject. Because I think also below, and you touched on this below facades, for example, there's aluminium as well. And so there's already a hierarchy there. And I feel like the kind of discipline specific things can quite easily reference down to those materials. But I think there's a way that they could reference up to a kind of more general guidance. And I think for that hierarchy could be really helpful, but it also helps give it context for different groups as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I you know, this diagram clearly doesn't show it that way, but that, you know, probably was in my mind sort of an intention I had was that it is something that sort of to the conversation we're just having with Caroline sort of sets a scene more broadly and probably does sit above in some sense to these other sort of areas. So yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. And then also maybe just to tie into all the other great MECLA content that's already there. Like if you want more more information on something in infrastructure or concrete or timber, here it is already. So yeah, obviously the purpose of this group is not to duplicate all that great content that's already out there, but to sort of reference and draw upon it.
My only second point, without opening a can of worms, sorry, I know there's other people. We've kind of looked at another white paper last year about breathable buildings, and I think the key challenge for that was to keep it on topic. And there's a huge amount of, you know, discussion. You know, sustainability is comfort and it's resilience and it's placemaking, and it's a lot of different things to a lot of people. And I think we have to be quite strict on staying on topic, and I think that's quite important to be kind of self-disciplined, and it's something we had to do previously for that other topic. But anyway, didn't want to open a can of worms. 10 minutes to go, but
I think that's a very fair point. Alesh, I'm very happy to see you. I'm going to disclose to everyone in the group, Alesh and I used to work together when he was at Hassel. He went back to Spain. He's now returned to Australia. Sorry for embarrassing you, Alesh. And he's now living up in the Gold Coast or Brisbane. Where are you?
Hey, Jeff. Nice here. Yeah. Came back a year ago. I'm in Brisbane, but moving to the Gold Coast very soon. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's where
nice to see you.
I am now. Yeah, nice to see you as well. It's good to be in this call, but sometimes I feel that I'm like in a bubble that everyone cares about sustainability. Well, you go out to the real world and it's not what you find. And a lot of people don't care. It could be they consider it too expensive, or it's just not even in their design, which is really sad to see. And I'm thinking a little bit about the outcome, because is this going to be just another guide what makes it different to the existing guides? And it's just the same people who read the other guides that are going to read this guide as well. So what concerns me is how to get to all these people who are not looking for this, they're not interested, and they're not going to read a guide. If there's other methods like social media or seminars or even CPD courses that we can get to people that usually wouldn't just go there and read another guide. And also once it's finished, how do we keep it going? Because if we spend 1-2 years developing a guide, it's not finished. It's a topic that it exists for the future as well. So is there a plan to just keep it live so people keep
well, that's a good question. No, that's a really good question. Let me answer the second one first. So again, in my sort of narrow view of this thing, I had thought that the types of guides that we're talking about are things that probably don't change over time. Like they don't, like, having more columns is always going to result in less carbon. That'll never change. So I had seen I'd seen this sort of exercise as a shorter and sharper thing, that this working group might necessarily be around for 2 years, that it would be probably much less than that. We'd all focus, produce guides, maybe the subgroups grow, maybe there's 1 or 2 sort of events. So it's not necessarily, and I'm happy to have that discussion to be proven otherwise, but I guess in my mind initially it wasn't something that was an ongoing living thing, because in my mind, again, just on one person is kind of setting it out there, but in my mind, there were these decisions that probably won't ever change, because there's sort of like laws of physics or just things that won't sort of change otherwise. And to your point around the audience, or like, that is clearly a challenge, but I do think, without going into a lot of detail, a lot of that sort of those challenges were discussed in our aluminium group, and it's there were some really good successes out of that. So it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. I certainly know what you're talking about, but I think the key is, you don't just want this to be, a sort of guide that goes to the 50 people or so that are on this call, or that already know it and everything. So yeah. Just mindful of time, because I have a hard finish at 5. I've got a client meeting at 5. I'm going to have to ask if there's any volunteers for any working groups, because we really would like to get that out of today. If we can't get it out of today, could you please email Alexander Barnstone or myself with an expression of interest, either to participate or to lead one of the subgroups. So I'll just preface that, but I might then throw to you, Asmita, first. And Alexi's just put his email in the chat. And I'll just go to this slide as well. Whoops, where'd it go?
Thank you, Jeff. I'll just make
Sure.
it quick. So I am an architectural designer and an emerging sustainability consultant. Just so happy to be here. So much to learn from resourceful people. So from what I understand is that this is producing by design and not exactly materials. And our target audience is sort of general crowd, and this is aimed to influence societal change. So in order to make it more interactive and people can relate to it, some of the live examples that people shared here, that sort of leads into what, when, and how. So those incidences, mentioning that as an interactive 1 or 2 pager where people can learn from actual situations and then understand, okay, why it's important to ask this question. So do you think it'd be helpful to add such an information into it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the way that, you know, like as Kieran started to frame that, the what, the when, the how, but also the why, and you know, to Carolyn's point earlier, I think framing, like that'd be a really nice way, sort of lens or sort of frame to put across all the certain areas. So maybe they have a consistent sort of format, or they start off, each sort of document or whatever we develop sort of starts off in the same way through the same lens. I think that's a really great way to look at it. Absolutely. And I can see that lots of people are starting to put stuff in the chat. I can't multitask and keep up, but it looks like people are saying happy to participate or whatever. So that's fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Hudson.
Jeff, I appreciate we're coming to the end of time. I guess I wanted to make a couple of concluding comments. One about the audience. As a consultant with my consulting hat, not my MECLA hat, a lot of our clients are getting ready for mandatory reporting. And so when they're making decisions about assets, and Monica and I will be talking at the Investor Group on Climate Change 20th anniversary conference late in October, you know, that's a whole investment class that are starting to think about embodied carbon, or are continuing to think about embodied carbon. We talk, and I've heard Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, I even heard the former New South Wales Planning Minister, Rob Stokes, talk about metrics for success in big projects being time, cost, quality, and carbon. How do they do that? Well, a guide like this, particularly the general one, will be a go-to for how do I do that? We need a new hospital, we need a new bridge, we need a new freeway, we need a new whatever. Do we really need it? Okay, if we really need it, how do we get there so that time, cost, quality, and carbon becomes one of the success metrics? I see this as feeding into solving that challenge, which I think is terrific. The other thing is, it's been mentioned by several people, this is a multidisciplinary group. Yes, it's designers predominantly, but with different focuses. So I dispute your comment that you've got a narrow view, Jeff. I would never say that, but I do think it is broadened by hearing people in different parts of the, you know, part of the ecosystem. This is ecosystem change, but this is, you know, from a central point around design. So thank you to you and to everybody else who's putting their hands up. This is fantastic.
Yep. Asmita, did you still have another question or a second question, or just a hand still up? Okay, all good, all good. I do that all the time. Well, I know Lexi will be sort of taking notes in terms of all the chats, and sort of, I guess what we'll do is we will kind of gather that all up, see who's kind of put their hands up to do what. And I imagine in the next week or two, we'll be sending out an email, probably, well, it might be to everyone who's put their hands up, whether they're part of the groups, but maybe just probably, yeah, outlining who's keen to participate, and if there's anyone that's put their hands up to lead. If not, then if no one's put their hands up to lead, then what we might do is in that sort of smaller forum, who people are really keen to participate going forward, then we can sort of have a more focused conversation on who might be potential leaders for each of the subgroups. Any other thoughts or questions? Because I'm really sorry, but I do have a 5 o'clock I must join, but really happy to see so many people that joined today, and I look forward to working with many of you going forward, and I think it should be good fun. Oh, good. Hudson?
Perfect.
Anything else?
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for putting your hands up. I do think happens when people get stuck in and get doing. So really appreciate people's time. Jeff, for your leadership on this. Alexi, Kati, and Monica behind the scenes for getting today happening, and then for convening what happens next. This is terrific. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.